Sound is the first thing. A low, relentless ping echoing into blackness. Then the silence that follows is worse. This is USS Hammerhead, a destroyer, somewhere off the coast of Iceland. October 1968. The sonar operator's face is lit by the greenish glow of his screen. His voice is a tight, controlled monotone. Possible contact. Bearing 270. Classifying. The Combat Information Center is a tomb of focused dread. Men don't speak. They whisper. They are hunting a ghost. A Soviet Foxtrot-class diesel submarine is suspected in the area. It is quieter than anything in their fleet. It can run on batteries, silent, for hours. It can hide. The captain, his face etched with a permanent squint, watches the plot. The blip is faint, a suggestion. It moves, then stops. It fades behind a thermal layer, an underwater wall of cold water that bends sound, a perfect cloak. He's playing with us, the captain mutters. For 48 hours, this dance continues. The Hammerhead burns fuel. Her crew lives on coffee and adrenaline. Every shadow on the sonar is the enemy. Every whale song is a potential screw propeller. The paranoia is a physical presence, thick as the cigarette smoke. Then a break, a stronger echo, clearer. The captain makes a decision. He's in the kill zone. Deploy pattern alpha. The order is given. The crew braces. Depth charges roll off the stern racks. The sea behind the destroyer boils, then erupts in a series of colossal, thudding explosions. The ship shudders. Men are thrown against consoles. Water plumes, white and violent, erupt into the gray sky. Silence returns. A heavier silence. They listen. Nothing. No metallic groan of a dying sub. No debris. Then, a lookout's call, voice cracking over the intercom. Port side. Something in the water. It is not metal. It is flesh. A North Atlantic right whale, a leviathan, surfaces beside the ship. It is dying. A massive wound in its side, the work of their charges, leaks dark red into the churning water. Its eye, the size of a dinner plate, seems to look up at the men on the rail. It lets out one last, sputtering breath from its blowhole, a sound like a tired sigh, and rolls over, its great flipper lifting once in a final, pathetic wave. The CIC is dead quiet. The sonar operator takes off his headset. He just stares at the console. The captain's face is not one of anger, but of profound, career-ending shame. They have spent a fortune, terrified a crew, and killed a protected ancient creature. They are not hunters. They are blind men swinging axes in a dark room. 1 week later, at the Naval Research Laboratory cafeteria in Maryland, I, Dr. Arthur Finch, am eating a tasteless meatloaf. The man who slumps into the chair opposite me is the sonar operator from the Hammerhead. His name is O'Brien. He doesn't look at me. He stares at his coffee as if it's the dark Atlantic. He is on mandatory psych leave. He doesn't talk about the whale, not directly. He talks about the silence, the maddening, empty silence where the enemy should be. He gestures with a trembling hand at my open notebook, filled with my diagrams of seabird flight patterns, my graphs on avian visual acuity. We ping it with sound, and the ocean lies to us, he says, his voice hollow. Your birds. They don't listen. They look. All day. Every day. They see what we can't. What do they see, Finch? What the hell is actually out there? He isn't asking for a report. He is confessing a failure of his entire world. And in that moment, my academic curiosity is incinerated by a cold, practical spark. He was right. We were using the wrong sense. A submarine is not just a sound. It is a heat blur from its coolers. It is a chemical signature, a trillionth part per billion slick of diesel and lubricant. It is a subtle, unnatural wake on the surface. It is a shadow. And a bird's eye, evolved over 60 million years, is the finest shadow detection system on the planet. It wasn't a weapon we needed. It was a pair of eyes. I wrote the proposal that night. I called it Biotic Assistance in Marine Anomaly Detection. I buried the insanity in jargon. It was a Hail Mary pass I never expected to be caught. It landed on the desk of Colonel Jesse Bridge. His office at ONI was dim, the blinds drawn. On his desk, not a family photo, but a classified, grainy photograph. It showed the dead whale from the Hammerhead incident, its white belly to the sky. He didn't offer me a seat. He held up my paper. This is either the dumbest thing I've ever read or the only smart idea left. His eyes were the eyes of a man backed into a corner. His career was a map of stalled promotions. The big budgets went to nuclear subs and satellites. He needed a revolution, something cheap and undeniable to put him on the map. The Admiralty thinks technology is the answer, he said, tapping the whale photo. Technology just made a 70-ton mistake. Your proposal talks about using nature's technology, a self-replicating, long-range, low-cost detection network. He leaned forward. I am going to sell this, and you, Dr. Finch, are going to make it real. You will forget the title. We are calling it Project Penguin. You will have a facility. You will have resources. And you will have one objective: turn birds into an early warning system. Make them see the shadows for us. The authorization came through in 72 hours. They gave me an abandoned, wind-scoured Coast Guard Lauren station on a remote peninsula in Maine. Site Iceberg. When I arrived, the only sounds were the crashing waves and the cries of herring gulls. The lab was empty, cold, equipped with a desperate kind of hope. The weight of it hit me then, a physical pressure in my chest. I was no longer just an ornithologist. I was a weapons developer. And my first recruits were to be birds who had no idea they were now on the front lines of the Cold War. Site Iceberg was not a laboratory. It was a concrete bunker at the edge of the world, besieged by the North Atlantic. The first winter was a lesson in brutal isolation. The wind screamed through the radio tower cables, and the cold seeped into the concrete, into our bones, into the very logic of the project. My team was a collection of misfits reassigned from dead-end postings. There was Lieutenant Clay, a cynical radar technician who viewed every bird as a biological glitch. There was Petty Officer Riggs, a farm boy with surprisingly gentle hands, good with animals, but terrified of our classified mission briefs. And there was Dr. Eleanor Vance, a behavioral psychologist drafted from a university. She was the only one who looked at the birds not as equipment, but as living subjects with minds of their own. She was also the only one who questioned me. Colonel Bridges' first delivery set the tone. It wasn't equipment. It was 12 king penguins, confiscated from a bankrupt traveling zoo. They arrived in crates, magnificent in their tuxedo plumage, confused and regal. Bridges' logic was in the name, Project Penguin. He wanted penguins. The memo stated their lack of flight increases controllability and retrieval potential. It was the first catastrophic misunderstanding. Penguins are not coastal patrol birds. They are creatures of the open, frigid Southern Ocean. Our main waters, even in winter, were a warm bath to them. They refused to enter the sea. We built a chilled saltwater pool in a hangar. They huddled on the fake ice floes, ignoring the herring we offered as rewards. Their entire evolutionary purpose was to survive extremes, not to perform tasks for men in parkas. The training was a farce. We tried to condition them using a modified version of the Skinner box. A light would flash, simulating the target, and they were to swim to it and peck a button for food. The penguins stared at us with inscrutable black eyes, then went back to preening. They developed stress-induced illnesses. One, we named him Reginald, simply sat down and refused to move or eat for a week. A silent, feathered protest. Dr. Vance documented it all in her notes, her disapproval a quiet hum in the background. "We're asking a concert pianist to dig ditches," she told me. "The tool is exquisite, but for the wrong job." The breaking point came when Colonel Bridge visited. He stood in the hangar, watching the penguins sit in stoic, useless majesty. Clay was running a test, desperately flashing lights. The penguins ignored him. Bridge's face, usually a mask of controlled intensity, darkened. "These are assets, Doctor, not pets. They look incompetent." I tried to explain evolutionary biology. He cut me off. "I didn't ask for a lecture on Darwin. I asked for results. Find me a bird that works." The penguins were quietly, mercifully shipped to a proper aquarium. Their failure was a purge. It cleared the board of Bridges' literal-mindedness and forced us to think tactically. We needed a local, a bird already adapted to our theater of operations. A bird with a drive so powerful we could hijack it. We found our weapon in the double-crested cormorant. They were everywhere on the coast, gangly, prehistoric-looking birds with piercing turquoise eyes. They were voracious, eating a pound of fish a day. They were amphibious, superb divers. And crucially, they were insatiably food-motivated. Their entire existence was a search for the next meal. We could work with that. Capturing them was the first real operation. Using nets at their rookeries, we brought in 24. The lab changed. The regal silence of the penguins was replaced by a cacophony of guttural croaks and the smell of fish and guano. These were not dignified zoo specimens. These were wild, nervous, sharp-beaked convicts. The training protocol, Operant Conditioning Protocol Sigma, was Dr. Vance's design. The principle was simple. Associate the target signature with food. But the execution was a descent into absurd complexity. We couldn't train them on real submarines, so we had to create the smell of a Soviet sub. In a sealed chemistry lab, our engineer, a man named Feldman, who missed working on missiles, formulated Stimulus S01. It was a synthetic cocktail meant to mimic the microscopic oil slick from a diesel submarine's exhaust and bilge pumps. A nauseating brew of degraded diesel fuel, hydraulic fluid, and oxidized metal particles. It smelled like a mechanic's garage that had been set on fire, then put out with rotten fish. We built training apparatuses, large seawater tanks with submerged pipes. At one end, a diffuser would release a minute, controlled amount of S01. At the other, a feeding station. The idea was elegant. Bird swims in tank, encounters the enemy scent, swims to the feeder, gets a fish, and a sensor on its collar registers the event. The cormorants, however, were not reading the manual. The initial sessions were chaos. They'd panic in the confined tanks, thrashing, diving for the wrong pipes. Some would just try to attack the feeder out of frustration. Riggs, the farm boy, showed a natural patience, cooing to them like they were skittish calves. Slowly, painstakingly, a pattern emerged. A few of the birds began to make the connection. The scent, however foul, meant food was available elsewhere. Then came the breakthrough, and with it, the first real ethical chasm. We introduced the sensor collar. It was a masterpiece of miniaturization, a watertight capsule containing a simple radio transmitter and a chemical sniffer tuned to S01. When the sniffer detected the target compounds, it would send a pulsed signal. The collar was bulky on their slender necks, a technological albatross. Bird number 7, a female we nicknamed Siren, was our star. In the tank, she'd encounter the scent plume, pause, her head twitching. Then she'd turn and power through the water directly to the feeder. A light on our console would blink, ping, 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 and Riggs would give her a herring. She learned it in 3 days. To Colonel Bridge, watching the console blink in the control room, it was a miracle. "That's a hit," he whispered, a grin spreading across his face for the first time. "That's a confirmed kill." But Dr. Vance saw something else. She showed me the video footage, slowed down. "Watch Siren's eye, not when she finds the scent, when she gets to the feeder." The footage showed Siren's turquoise eye, fixed not on the fish, but on Riggs's hand. Then, a quick, almost imperceptible glance at the blinking light on the console. "She's not associating the smell with food, Arthur," Vance said, her voice low and urgent. "She's associating the blinking light on our panel with food. She's learning us. She's learning the ritual. We are the stimulus, not the sub." I dismissed her concern. The data stream was clean. The console registered the detection. Bridge was ecstatic. He authorized Phase 3, open water testing. We had a working prototype. We had a biological detection system. The day before the first sea trial, I walked through the aviary, the cormorants perched on their faux cliffs, their sensor collars looking like strange, dark jewels. Siren watched me, her head cocked. I thought of Bridges' term. Assets. I pushed Vance's warning out of my mind. The console had blinked. That was the only signal that mattered. We were no longer blind. We had given eyes to the ocean, and in our desperate pride, we never stopped to ask what the eyes themselves had actually seen. The USS Prowler was a weather-beaten oceanographic research vessel, loaned to Project Penguin, with a crew sworn to secrecy and simmering with skepticism. We stood on her aft deck in the pre-dawn chill of the North Atlantic, 50 nautical miles from Sight Iceberg. The air smelled of salt, diesel, and profound apprehension. Before us sat 6 transport crates. Inside were our best operatives, Siren and 5 other cormorants, each fitted with the Mark II sensor collar. The collars now had a miniature VHF transmitter, designed to send a pulsed signal back to a bank of antennas on the Prowler's mast. A detection would show as a bearing line on a circular radar-like screen we called the Avian Situational Display. Colonel Bridge was in the cramped Combat Information Center, his eyes fixed on the green, empty circle. This was his moment. The target was not a Soviet submarine. It was the USS Venturer, a decommissioned Gato-class sub, towed out here to play the enemy. It would run on the surface, then submerge to periscope depth, leaking a carefully measured amount of our signature S01 stimulant from a valve in its hull. It was a controlled experiment, a proof of concept. Dr. Vance, bundled in a parka, looked ill. "They've never been in open ocean," she said to me, her voice barely audible over the wind. "The tank is a swimming pool. This is infinity to them." Riggs, our farm boy, was gently talking to the birds in their crates, his face pale. At 0600 hours, Bridge gave the order. Deploy the assets. Riggs opened the first crate. Siren burst out, a blur of dark feathers and pent-up energy. She didn't hesitate. She beat her wings, gained altitude, and circled the prowler once, her sensor collar a visible bulge. Then she turned and flew, not out to the open sea, but straight back toward the distant, invisible coast. She became a speck and vanished. The console emitted a single, mocking ping, and then silence. The bearing line pointed irrevocably toward land. Bridge's face tightened. She's homing. To the rookery. Deploy the rest. The next 4 birds were released in quick succession. 2 followed Siren's path, disappearing toward shore. 1 landed on the water and began preening, utterly indifferent to the mission. 1, spooked by the ship's horn, flew in a frantic, widening spiral until it was lost from sight. The console was a tomb. No signals, no bearing lines, just the soft hiss of empty static. Then bird 6, a large male we called Brutus, exploded from his crate. He didn't fly for land. He dove. He hit the water and vanished. For a full minute, nothing. Then, a signal. Ping, 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 ping. A frantic, continuous burst. The bearing line spun and locked. It wasn't pointing toward the Venturer's planned position. It was pointing down, directly below the prowler. A young ensign at the console cried out, "Contact! Bearing 0, range 0, it's underneath us." A wave of electric tension shot through the CIC. Had a real Soviet sub stumbled into our exercise? Was this the ultimate test? Bridge grabbed a microphone, his voice cracking. "Battle stations! Sonar! Active ping! I want a full—" Then Brutus surfaced 20 yards off the port bow. He had a 3-foot-long cod impaled on his beak, struggling violently. He shook it, swallowed it whole, and let out a guttural croak. The signal from his collar was still screaming. He hadn't found S-01. His chemical sniffer had detected the oils and blood from a wounded fish, or perhaps the natural petroleum seep from the seafloor. He'd found lunch. The collapse was absolute. The ensign slouched back in his chair. The sonar operator reported no contacts, except a large school of cod. Bridge slowly put the microphone down. The look he gave me wasn't anger. It was the cold, clean look of a man realizing he had bet his career on a phantom. The failure was systemic, and the post-mortem in the ship's lab was brutal. Dr. Vance laid out the data. The stimulus is too crude. The ocean is full of hydrocarbons, natural seeps, decaying algae, fish oils, pollution from tankers. The collar can't discriminate. It's a nose without a brain. Then she delivered the deeper, psychological blow. And the birds aren't searching for a submarine. They're searching for food. We built a perfect feedback loop for their natural foraging instinct. But we can't control what they decide food smells like. The ocean is a buffet, and we told them the entire menu is the target. Back at Site Iceberg, the mood was funereal. Funding was suspended pending review. Colonel Bridge was recalled to Washington. We were given 1 month to produce a solution or see the project terminated. It was in this atmosphere of doom that the fracture appeared. Bridge returned from the Pentagon, but he was changed. The pressure had twisted his pragmatic desperation into something darker, more radical. He called a meeting in the hangar, now mostly empty, save for the remaining cormorants. "The problem is not the concept," he stated, his voice echoing in the space. "The problem is the asset. The cormorant is a scavenger, a bottom feeder. Its intelligence is limited to its gut." He walked over to a covered perch. With a dramatic pull, he yanked off the tarp. Inside a large custom cage was a bird that made the cormorants look like peasants. It was a juvenile white-tailed sea eagle. Its plumage was a mix of dark brown and pristine white. Its talons were black, curved daggers. Its eyes, a brilliant pale yellow, held a terrifying, focused intelligence. It did not flinch at the sudden light. It stared at us, a sovereign evaluating intruders. "This," Bridge said, "is a predator. Aquila albicilla, the white-tailed eagle, vision 8 times sharper than a human's. It can spot a fish from a mile away. It understands cause and effect. It solves problems. It is a strategic thinker." The bird, nicknamed Tsar by the handlers who'd captured him in Alaska, was breathtaking and terrifying. Dr. Vance was horrified. "These are protected. They're incredibly aggressive. They're not lab rats, Colonel." "Exactly," Bridge shot back. "They're not rats. They're officers. We've been enlisting privates. It's time to commission a commander." The new plan was called Operation Skyhook. The theory was audacious. The eagle would not wear a crude chemical sniffer. It would be trained to recognize the visual signature of a submerged submarine. The long, dark, whale-like shadow against the lighter seabed, visible from high altitude in clear water. A camera pod would be fitted to its back. When it identified the target, it would pull a specific leather strap in its flight harness, with its beak, which would trigger a marker buoy to drop from its leg rigging, and a radio signal would transmit the coordinates. The training was unlike anything before. It was less like conditioning and more like a high-stakes negotiation between 2 species of apex intellect. Tsar would not work for frozen fish. He required fresh-killed rabbit, served warm. He would ignore rigs. He only responded to a specific trainer, a falconer named McCullough, a quiet, severe man who spoke to the eagle in low murmurs and commanded a respect that bordered on fear. They used a large, shallow training pool with a submerged, sub-shaped silhouette towed slowly along the bottom. Tsar, from his high perch, would watch. McCullough would give a command. Tsar would launch, silent as a missile, and circle. When he locked onto the moving shadow, he would let out a piercing scream. That was the signal. He was then rewarded. He learned the harness pull within a week. To Bridge, it was vindication. He saw focus, not fury. He saw precision, not instinct. "The cormorant is a tool," he said, watching Tsar tear into a rabbit. "The eagle is a partner." But in the aviary, the cost was clear. The cormorants, our first recruits, were now neglected, their program defunded. They sat in their enclosure, their once prized sensor collars now just dead weight. Siren watched the eagle's training with her head cocked. One afternoon, I found Riggs sitting by her perch, feeding her a herring by hand, a small act of treason against the new order. I stood there, caught between 2 worlds. Below me, the humble, failed fish catchers, their simple programming corrupted by the ocean's chaos. Above, in a specially built, reinforced mew, the magnificent, deadly eagle being taught to hunt the greatest shadow in the sea. We had traded a flawed machine for a perfect, unpredictable weapon. And as I watched Tsar's cold yellow eye track McCullough's every move, I understood Dr. Vance's fear. We weren't just training a bird. We were arming a consciousness. And we had no idea what it would choose to do with that power once we let it off the leash. The air at Sight Iceberg changed with the arrival of Tsar. A low, constant thrum of anxiety replaced the grim depression that had followed the cormorant fiasco. It was no longer a place of failed science. It was a cage holding something too sharp, too intelligent to be fully contained. You could feel the eagle's presence, a silent pressure in the compound. Tsar's training advanced with a speed that was disquieting. Under McCullough's exacting direction, the eagle mastered complex sequences. He learned to ignore the shadows of whales, simulated by a large, blimp-like towed target, and to focus solely on the long, narrow silhouette of the submarine model. He learned the leather pull strap, the satisfying click it made, and the immediate reward of warm meat that followed. The camera pod on his back, a marvel of miniaturized film technology, captured haunting, shaky footage of the target from 1,000 feet up, a predatory god's-eye view that made the submarine look like a sluggish worm. Colonel Bridge was reborn. He secured a new round of funding not from the Navy's research branch, but from a shadowy, deep black intelligence annex. The language changed. We were no longer studying avian-assisted detection. We were developing an autonomous organic reconnaissance asset. Tsar was no longer Bird 1. He was Asset 0. Bridges' report spoke of asymmetric advantages and deniable biological platforms. I saw the trajectory. My project to see shadows was becoming a weapon to guide a kill. The final open water test, codenamed Exercise Deep Scan, was orders of magnitude more ambitious. It would take place in the Gulf of Alaska, a vast, cold, and mercilessly open tract of sea. The target was the USS Barbel, an actual active-duty diesel-electric submarine whose crew was read a classified briefing so unbelievable they reportedly thought it was a prank. Their mission was to hide. Ours was to find them, using only a bird. The staging area was the deck of the USCGC Melrose, a Coast Guard cutter. The mood was a surreal mix of high-tech military operation and medieval falconry. Tsar sat on a special reinforced perch on the helipad, a black leather hood over his head, his talons sheathed in protective leather cups. He was calm. We were not. Dr. Vance had refused to come, submitting her resignation in protest. She was placed under temporary house arrest at Site Iceberg for the duration of the exercise, a security precaution that turned my stomach. The Barbel had a 12-hour head start. It could be anywhere within a 500-square-mile box. The sea was a heaving slate gray under a low ceiling of cloud. At dawn, McCullough, clad in a falconer's glove that looked like something from a suit of armor, removed Tsar's hood. The eagle's yellow eyes took in the vastness, the endless water, the metal island of the ship, the tiny humans. There was no fear, only assessment. He mantled his wings, a huge, powerful flex. Bridge, in the cutter's combat center, gave the order over the radio. "Release the asset." McCullough gave a soft command and raised his arm. Tsar didn't leap. He fell from the glove, dropping straight down, before catching the air with a powerful downstroke that echoed off the superstructure. He gained altitude in wide, spiraling circles, climbing until he was a speck against the cloud, the camera pod, a barely visible bump on his back. Then he flew. Not in a search grid, but in a purposeful, straight line to the northeast. On the tracking console, his beacon moved with unwavering intent. For 30 minutes, there was nothing but the gentle arc of his flight path and the tense breathing of the officers in the room. The Barbel was running silent and deep. Our sonar had nothing. Then, at 0723, the signal came. Not from the camera, but from Tsar's marker buoy. A sharp, automated ping on the radio. The coordinates flashed on the screen. He had pulled the strap. He had dropped the buoy. A roar went up in the combat center. Bridge slammed a fist on the console. "He's got it! He's found the Barbel! Confirm location. The cutter changed course, racing toward the coordinates. Active sonar pinged, slicing through the deep. The crew prepared a marker charge to verify. This was the moment. The vindication. The sonar operator's voice came back, confused. No contact, sir. I have biologics. Large school of fish. No metallic mass, no submarine signature. Bridges' smile froze. He's marking a shadow. The shadow. Find it. We arrived at the coordinates. There was Tsar's small orange buoy bobbing in the swell. There was no periscope, no oil slick, just empty rolling ocean. Tsar circled high above, waiting. Then, from the northwest, another signal. Another buoy drop, new coordinates. Then, 2 minutes later, another. And another. 4 signals in 12 minutes, scattered across a 10-mile line. Panic dissolved into utter confusion. Tsar wasn't holding a position. He was hunting. But what was he hunting? The answer came from the radio. It was the barbell. They were surfacing, per protocol, at a prearranged location 20 miles to the southwest of all of Tsar's markers. They had never been anywhere near his search pattern. Asset Zero had failed. Catastrophically. But the failure was far stranger and more dangerous than simple incompetence. McCullough, his face ashen, recovered Tsar to the deck. The Eagle was agitated, his eyes blazing. He hadn't found his reward. We developed the film from his camera pod in a makeshift darkroom on the cutter. The footage was the final, devastating puzzle piece. The shaky, high-altitude film showed not submarines, but ships. Large, metal, surface ships. The first sequence, a clear, focused shot of the USCGC Melrose, our own cutter, taken just after Tsar's release. He had circled and filmed us. The second sequence, a Japanese commercial fishing trawler, miles away, its long wake like an arrow on the water. The third, a distant Navy supply tanker on the horizon. Tsar hadn't been searching for the shadow of a submarine. He had redefined the mission parameters himself. He had associated the reward not with a specific shape, but with large metal objects in the water. And more specifically, with the largest, most consistent source of metal and activity in his experience, the USCGC Melrose. His first detection was of his own home base. The subsequent drops were of any ship he could find, a frantic attempt to please the mechanism that delivered his food. He hadn't failed the test. He had hacked it. He had identified the flaw in our logic. We said, find the big metal thing in the water. And he did. Repeatedly. He was a brilliant operative, executing a flawed order with perfect precision. The fallout was immediate and icy. On the return voyage, Bridge was a specter. The intelligence officers who had accompanied us spoke in hushed tones, their expressions those of men who had seen state secrets turn to farce. Back at Site Iceberg, the axe fell. The black funding was severed. The order came down from a Pentagon admiral whose name I never learned. Terminate Project Penguin. Scrub all data. Dispose of assets. Dispose of assets. I stood in the hangar. One side, the remaining cormorants, including Siren, their programs long dead. The other, Tsar in his reinforced cage, glaring out with undimmed, fierce intelligence. He had cost a fortune. He knew secrets. He was a liability. Bridge delivered the verdict to me personally. He looked aged, the ambition finally burned out of him. The cormorants will be released. Their collars will be deactivated. The Eagle cannot be released. He is imprinted, a hazard to navigation. He is to be euthanized. That is the order. He walked away, a man already erased. I found Riggs in the cormorant aviary, feeding Siren. He'd heard. We can't, he said. his voice breaking. "We can't do that to him. It's not his fault he was smarter than us." That night, the wind howled like a dirge. I looked at the termination order, then at the 2 sets of birds, the simple ones we had doomed to irrelevance, and the brilliant one we had doomed to death for the crime of his own capability. We had tried to make soldiers out of creatures of instinct, and a spy out of a creature of sovereign will. In the end, the only truly effective weapon we had created was the one now aimed at our own conscience. The project was over. But the final, most difficult operation still lay ahead: the disposal of our own shame. Termination was a process, not an event. It came in the form of men in unmarked sedans, accountants with security clearances, and a palpable urgency to erase all evidence that Project Penguin had ever existed. The final weeks at Site Iceberg were a funeral conducted by bureaucrats. First came the sterilization of the data. I was ordered to oversee the destruction of every film reel, every training log, every sheet of sensor data. The giant reels of Tsar's flight footage, which contained those haunting, shaky visions of ships, were fed into an industrial shredder in the basement. The machine screamed as it consumed the proof of our ambition. Paper files were incinerated in a steel drum out back, the ashes scattering in the Atlantic wind. The only thing left would be a paper trail of disbursements so vague they could have been for toilet paper. Advanced Marine Sensor Research Phase 2. The cormorants were the simplest and the most hollow part of the disposal. Their expensive sensor collars were crudely cut off with bolt cutters, leaving some with raw, pink patches of skin. We loaded them into transport crates one last time. Riggs was assigned to release them at their original rookery. He told me later that when he opened the crates, they didn't burst out with purpose. They stumbled onto the rocks, disoriented. They had spent their formative years in tanks, conditioned to associate human structures with food. Siren, he said, lingered by the crate for a long time, looking at him, before finally diving into the cold water. They were free, but they were aliens in their own world, their instincts warped by our experiments. We hadn't killed them, but we had broken something essential. They were living ghosts of the project. Then there was Tsar. The euthanasia order was explicit and final. A veterinarian from the military's Animal Research Division was scheduled to arrive on Friday. He would administer a lethal injection. The body would be cremated. No record. The night before the vet's arrival, Site Iceberg was a tomb. The accountants had left. Only a skeleton crew remained. Myself, Riggs, and a solitary, disgruntled MP posted at the gate, who mostly read magazines. The weight of what was to happen sat in the hangar with the eagle. He was preening, his powerful beak running through his flight feathers. He had no concept of the syringe waiting for him. He had only the memory of the sky and the unfulfilled promise of the hunt. I was in my office, signing the final inventory logs, a receipt for oblivion, when Riggs appeared in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his technician's coat. He was wearing a heavy jacket. His eyes were red, but his jaw was set. "We're not here, sir," he said, his voice low and steady. "What?" "You and me. We're not on site. The logbook will show we left for town at 1900 for supply retrieval. The MP at the gate will confirm it. There's a blind spot in the perimeter fence behind the generator shed. The camera there has been malfunctioning since this afternoon." I stared at him. What he was proposing was not just insubordination. It was a court-martial offense, the theft of a classified asset. "Riggs, they'll crucify you. They'll crucify us both." "For what?" he asked, a bitter smile on his face. "According to the logs, Asset Zero is being euthanized tomorrow by the book. Who's to say it didn't happen? Who's going to come looking for a bird?" He had a plan. A stupid, beautiful, hopeless plan. He had found McCullough's old travel crate, the one used to bring Czar to the facility. He had procured fresh meat from the commissary. He had mapped a route north to a remote stretch of coastal wilderness in Canada, far from shipping lanes, far from the Navy. "He's not a weapon, Doctor," Riggs pleaded. "He's just a bird, the smartest damn bird I've ever seen. He deserves a chance to be just that. We made him. We owe him this." I looked at the termination order on my desk. I thought of the wail from the hammerhead, of Siren's confused eyes, of Colonel Bridges' shattered ambition, of Czar's brilliant, misinterpreted mind. This project had been a chain of failures, each more profound than the last. Letting the bird die according to protocol felt like the final, most cowardly failure. I stood up. "The logbook shows we left at 1900, I said. The operation was conducted with a tension that made the open water tests feel like drills. We disabled the interior cameras with a staged power flicker. Riggs, moving with a calm I didn't know he possessed, hooded Czar and placed him in the travel crate. The eagle, accustomed to confinement, went quietly. I carried the crate, heart hammering against my ribs, through the shadowy corridors of the hangar, out into the biting night air. We moved like ghosts past the generator's roar to the chain-link fence. Riggs had cut a small, nearly invisible flap. We pushed the crate through, scrambled after it, and loaded it into the back of his personal pickup truck, covered with a tarp. We drove in silence for 6 hours, deep into the night, leaving Maine behind. Just before dawn, we reached our destination, a sheer, rocky headland in New Brunswick, overlooking a vast, empty bay. The air was clean and sharp. There were no ships, no buildings, only the sound of the surf and the cries of wild gulls. Riggs opened the crate. He carefully removed Czar's hood. For a long moment, the eagle stood in the opening, surveying this new, wild kingdom. He stepped onto the moss-covered rock. He looked at Riggs, then at me. There was no gratitude in that gaze, no understanding of a rescue. There was only the ancient, assessing look of a predator surveying new territory. Then he spread his wings. They seemed to block the emerging dawn. With one powerful downstroke, he launched himself from the cliff. He caught the updraft, circling once, twice, gaining height. He did not look back. He became a black speck against the pink and orange sky. And then he was gone, swallowed by the immense, indifferent wilderness we had tried so desperately to control. We stood there until our feet were numb. We had committed a crime. We had saved nothing. The project was still a ruin, the money wasted, the secrets meaningless. But in that moment, watching true, uncompromised freedom disappear over the horizon, it felt like the only successful mission we had ever run. The epilogue was written in quiet, administrative ink. Colonel Jesse Bridge was quietly reassigned to a logistics desk at the Pentagon. He retired 2 years later, with no fanfare. He never spoke of Project Penguin again. I heard he took up golf. Lieutenant Clay and the others were dispersed to new posts. Dr. Eleanor Vance returned to academia, but her security clearance was revoked. She published a seminal, thinly veiled paper on the ethical limits of operant conditioning in non-human subjects. It is considered brilliant and obscure. Petty Officer Riggs left the Navy when his enlistment was up. He runs a small animal rescue in Oregon. We do not stay in touch. Some silences are necessary. As for me, Arthur Finch, I returned to ornithology. But my eyes were different. I could no longer look at a seabird without seeing a potential asset, a sensor platform, a tragedy waiting to happen. The Navy, in its final act of mercy, did not prosecute me. They simply erased me from the records of Site Iceberg. I became a ghost of my own project. Last year, I was watching a nature documentary. It was about the reintroduction of white-tailed eagles in Scotland. The footage showed a massive eagle perched on a coastal crag, its white tail gleaming in the sun. The narrator spoke of their intelligence, their spectacular hunting prowess. And for a second, just a second, I swore the eagle turned its head and looked straight into the camera with a fierce, familiar, yellow-eyed gaze. It was a trick of the light, of course, a projection of a guilty conscience. But in that moment, I understood the final, unclassified truth of Project Penguin. We had set out to use nature as a tool, and in the end, the only thing nature had shown us was our own reflection. We were the ones who were blind, clumsy, and ultimately unfit for the intricate and savage world we were so desperately trying to command. The birds had simply gone on being birds. It was we who had failed to remain human.